In this video, I'm going to re-examine the expanding circle construction from my last blog post. In that post, I showed how you could build the construction so that the parabola opened upwards. The problem was that if you went a little bit further and tried to explore to see if the parabola could open downwards, the construction failed because it wasn't robust enough. So let's see how we can rebuild this construction to make it work. Quickly, let's see how it was built the first time. So I started by making a circle with a center point along the y-axis, and that intersected the y-axis at 2 points, B and D. And D played a pretty big role in this construction because we used that point to construct a tangent line through point D to the circle that intersected some other lines at points G and H. And G and H, when we dragged point C, are what actually traced my parabola. So the details of that construction you can watch in my video from the prior post, but I wanted to highlight the fact that we have these two distinct points, B and D, where the circle intersects the y-axis. Now we run into a little trouble with this if, as my colleague Scott suggested, we want to try the situation where point C lies below point B. So watch what happens with point D when I drag point C downward. When I get to the point where C goes below point B, suddenly B and D are one and the same point. Point D is not down here. And that's a problem because that means that our construction of this parabola is not going to work in this situation because this point is not where we need it to be. So let's see if we can fix that on page 2. So I'll start by constructing a circle, and I'll place the center on the y-axis and this point on the circumference also on the y-axis. And let's label these as we did on the prior page as C and B. And before, when I did this construction, I simply placed the point here on the y-axis and labeled it D. And once again, we can see if I drag point C below B, that D and B become one and the same location, and we no longer have this other intersection point. So that's no good. Let's back up. So as a remedy to that, let's make sure that this other intersection point always exists. And one way to do that is to take point B and reflect it across a mirror line that passes through C. So in particular, I'm going to use the perpendicular line tool, and I am going to create a perpendicular to the y-axis, so I'll tap that, and the perpendicular will pass through point C. So here is this mirror line, and if I take the reflect tool and I reflect point B across the mirror, here is my reflected point, and when I drag point C below B, that point still exists. So I have a much more robust model to begin with here to use. So I can now hide this mirror line. I'm going to have a lot of other lines. I no longer need to see it. So I'll use the visibility widget and tap on it and tap again to hide it. I should probably also label this reflected point. So I'll do that. And actually we see it labeled here as B prime, which is fine, but let's change it to what we had before. So let's make that instead point D. Okay, now to quickly run through the rest of the construction, which is the same as the last time, I am going to make a, perpendicular to the x-axis that passes through this intersection of the circle and the x-axis right there, and do that yet again, this time through the other intersection point of the circle with the x-axis. And I need a tangent through point D, so that is going to be perpendicular to the y-axis, passing through D. And here I have what looks like what I had before. So now I'm going to place my 2 points at the intersection of these lines, and I'm going to trace those 2 points using the trace widget. So if I now drag point C, this gives us what we had before, our parabola pointing up. And I'm going to erase traces and briefly disable tracing as I rearrange the location of these objects. So I'm placing point C below point B, and I'm making sure that the circle intersects the x-axis. Here I have point D again, and here are my 2 points that I'd like to trace. So let's enable tracing and drag point C up and down, and look, lo and behold, we have our parabola, this time opening downwards. So thank you to Scott for recommending this approach, which gives us a much more robust parabola construction.